Hey Wargamers, welcome back. This is the shooting gameplay segment. We're going to go over some of the basics here of rolling the dice when it comes down to declaring your shots, marking off your ammo, shooting, hit locations, all that good stuff. So our test subject today is going to be a Centurion CN9A, and he's going to be firing downrange at this Jenner that just came out of the forest there. And so the first thing that happens in the shooting phase is declaring your shots. And this can be done basically sequentially, where we go by initiative order with the loser declaring first, and then the winner declaring next, and then alternating back and forth until every mech has declared. Or if it's not super high stakes and it doesn't matter, you can just go ahead and declare in whatever order makes sense. That's fine too. The next thing is marking ammo. So let's say that my Centurion here is going to declare, and he's going to declare at this Jenner. So once he figures out what weapons he's firing, if he's firing any with ammunition, you want to mark those off right away. You don't want to forget this. There's nothing worse than getting down to an ammo explosion and realizing that you haven't been tracking any of the ammo the whole game. Makes your opponent very grumpy. And so I guess what we should do here is figure out how far apart these mechs are. So at any point, you could take a measuring tape or a ruler and take a look and see, hey, how far are these guys, right? So it's somewhere between 12 and 13 inches, like, maybe 12 and a half. Might be hard to see with the perspective of the camera, but it's about 12 and a half inches. Now on a 2D hex map, you'll never be at a half of an inch or half of a hex, right? It's always a full hex. It's very easy to determine your range. On a 3D map like this, you simply always round up. Think about it like, is my weapon within a certain range, or am I within a certain range? So if you're trying to be within 12 inches and you're at 12.5, bad news. You're actually at 13 inches. You're not within 12 inches. So again, you always just round up. It's pretty simple. Just keep that rule in mind if you're playing on a 3D map like this. Okay, so we're basically at 13 inches. So if we take a look at the Centurion's record sheet here, and we take a look at the weapons, so it has an LRM-10, an autocannon 10, and a medium laser that it can bring to bear in the forward arc. Medium laser is out of range, but the LRM-10 and the autocannon are in range. Now, again, we're at 13 inches. The autocannon has a long range of 15 and a medium range of 10. So it's over 10, but less than 15. That means it's at long range. The LRM, on the other hand, has a 14-inch medium range, which means it's definitely within medium range. Short range is 7 inches, definitely not in short range. So the LRM is at medium range. All right, so we declare that we're going to fire those weapons. We go back to the record sheet here, and we simply mark off the ammo there. There's ammo on the record sheet. Just put a dot next to it or cross it out and put the new number in, whatever method works for you. Some of our newer record sheets that we have on Solaris, we modified it so it prints out little bubbles that you can fill in. Pretty cool. So anyway, so once all 4 of the mechs on the board have declared, so in this game, right, we have 4 mechs. Once they're all done declaring, that's when you start pulling the trigger. So everybody declares, everybody marks off their ammo, then we start shooting. So let's say the Centurion is up and it's ready to shoot down at this Jenner. So the first thing that happens is we have to figure out the target number. So remember, we talked about Gator, gunnery, attacker mod, target mod, other mods, range. Pretty simple to remember. All of our mechs on this board here have a gunnery of 2, so we're going to start with a base number of 2, and then we add our attacker mod. Well, conveniently, our attacker mod is the yellow die. That's a 1, so we're going to add 1 to that. And then our target mod, we go over to our target, that's the green die. All right, so we add another 2. So we are at a total of 5 so far. Now let's say we're starting with our autocannon 10. Again, this weapon is at long range. So if you're playing rules as written, the long range modifier is a +4. It's pretty substantial. Now a +4 modifier is going to, again, get tacked on to that 5. We're going to assume that there's no other mods because, again, we got a clear shot, clear line of sight, and these mechs aren't damaged yet, so nothing else is coming into play. So our G is 2, our A is 1, our T is 2, our O is 0, and now our R is 4. Remember, we're at long range. So So we add all those things up, we have a 9. So we need to roll 2d6 and get a 9 or better to hit. Look at that. Convenient. We've hit with the autocannon 10. Should really do some damage to the Jenner. The next thing we need to do is roll for location. So I roll those 2 dice again, and I have a 6. So I look at the front hit location chart because, again, we're shooting straight down that Jenner right into his front arc. I look up a 6. That's a right torso. So the Jenner player would immediately go to their record sheet, mark off the damage to the right torso. Again, we got a separate video coming up on how to do all that. So now we move on to our LRM 10. We go back to our Gator. Remember, GATO, that was a 5. That's sort of like the base number. In most scenarios, if you're shooting at the same mech, that's never going to change. The only thing that's variable is range. So in this case, our autocannon 10 was at long range. Our LRM 10 is at medium range. So our R goes from a 4 to a 2, which means our target number is only a 7 for the LRM. So I roll those 2 dice, but unfortunately I got a 6. It's a miss. But since it's a tutorial, let's pretend we hit. So let's say we rolled an 8 and we got a pretty decent hit. So both weapons hit. Missiles operate a little bit differently. So LRMs, SRMs, MRMs, even some cluster weapons that fire like buckshot, like an LBX autocannon. There's many more, and it will tell you in the rules which ones will roll on the cluster hit table. They have to roll to see how many of their munitions actually struck the target. So in this case, we've got 10 missiles screaming across the battlefield at the Jenner. How many of them hit? Well, I have to roll 2d6 again. I got a 10. Pretty good. There's a chart in the book that tells you how many missiles will hit. So I got a 10 on my 2d6 roll, and I go over to the column of 10 missiles because, again, it's firing 10 missiles. It's an LRM 10. And that tells me that 8 of my missiles hit. Now, those missiles will group differently. Those munitions will group differently. In the case of an LRM, they always group into damage groups of 5. So 8 divided by 5 is a decimal, right? There's a remainder, there's a fraction there. So what happens is you get 2 groups. You get a group of 5 and then a group of 3. And what I would do is I would roll 2 hits on the hit location table to determine what goes where. So I'd have to declare and say, okay, this is for the 5-point group, and I got an 8. That's left torso. Okay, now the 3-point group, a 10. That's left arm, right? And that's how that would work. SRMs group differently. They group into into groups of 1 missile or 2 points of damage. So if I fire an SRM 6 and all of my missiles hit, I have to roll 6 different locations, and so on and so forth. And you can look in the rule book. It tells you exactly how everything breaks down. But SRMs, LRMs are the basic ones that you're going to be playing with in this Succession Wars era. All right, cool. So that's shooting in a nutshell. We talked again about declaring the target. We talked about marking your ammo on your sheet, and then firing your weapons, calculating Gator, and then also rolling for location after you hit. And remember, the marking damage is a separate video, but in a real game, what's going to happen is the Jenner player would now immediately go to his record sheet and mark off this damage before we moved on to any other mechs firing. That way you don't forget what hit. But none of the effects of that damage would take place until the next phase, which is the physical phase. And that's it. Now, line of sight is where you'll probably see the most divergence in rules between a 3D environment and the classic two-dimensional hex map. And so we're going to start with this. This is a little more straightforward, and then we'll move on to the 3D terrain. Check this guy out. This is straight out of 1985. It's a relic from the collection there. Very cool. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how line of sight works on this, and then we'll move on to the larger 3D environment and give you an idea of how it all works. It is very similar from a concept perspective, just some minor differences, especially when it comes to partial cover. So right now what we're looking at is these brownish hexes are clear hexes. There's just nothing in them. Consider them like open ground. We've got some rough terrain. We have some hills, and you see they're marked level 1, level 2. We have some forests, and notice these forests are actually up on the hill. It has a level here, right? So level 3 means it's a forest at level 3. Other forests that are not marked, so that's just level 0, right on the ground level. We have some water back here that tells you what depth it's at. Okay, so right now, if we are to determine line of sight, and that means, can the Centurion see the Clint? Okay, I'm going through 3 open hexes, I can definitely see him. There's literally nothing in the way here. Even in a 2-dimensional world, there's nothing in the way that would even remotely obstruct line of sight. So that's considered clear line of sight. But what happens if the Clint is over here behind the forest? How does that work? So if you're behind forest, right, or in forest, here's how it works. Forests come in 2 flavors, light and heavy. These hexes are pre-printed, like some of them are a little more dense than others, so I'm assuming the denser ones are heavy woods. There's a point system, so light woods constitute 1 point, heavy woods constitute 2 points. If your line of sight crosses a sum of 3 or more points, your line of sight is blocked. Okay, that means that you can only see through 2 hexes of light woods before your line of sight is blocked, or just 1 hex of heavy woods, all right, before your line of sight is blocked. So in this scenario, we draw our line of sight. It's a real straight, even line here. Okay, get you a little top-down view. It's nice and easy. And we've gone through 1 light woods hex, so that's only 1 point. All right, we're good. We have line of sight. However, this hex of woods would provide a +1 other modifier. Right, so when you're calculating your gator, we talked about this in the shooting videos, when you're calculating your gator, you would add 1 for this hex of woods. All right, light woods is +1 for the gator, heavy woods is +2. It conveniently corresponds to how many points you get when you're trying to calculate whether or not you can see. It also corresponds conveniently to how many MP it costs to move through. So we talked about this in the movement. If I wanted to move this Clint into this, it would cost 2 MP. All right, but let's stick to line of sight. So again, drawing line of sight here, you could do it. This only constitutes 1 point towards a line of sight calculation, if you will. All right, but what happens if the Clint is here? Okay, so then what? Well, it's not on a straight line, right? So you can see that I have to do something goofy to get there, and you have to do that when you're counting range too. You know, you can count in a few different ways to determine what's the shortest path. All right, it's not like just a ruler where you just measure the straight line, right? You got to count hexes. So the shortest path here, either way, I have to go through both a light woods hex and a heavy woods hex to get to the Clint. And unfortunately, 1 point, 2, 3 points. All right, my line of sight would be blocked by that path. 1 point, 3 points. So either way, I would not be able to see the Clint from this position. So that is kind of how that works. We draw that line. You know, we know that it can probably take, I actually think if you drew it, you would have to actually take this path. I'm kind of bad with figuring that out, but it looks like, yeah, you would have to take this path. So either way it would be blocked, but even the prescribed path there still blocked, right? So hopefully that makes sense. So again, when you're sort of drawing line of sight across the hex map, you would kind of draw a straight line and then figure out, you know, again, which hexes correspond to that line. And when a line crosses through 2 hexes, you would have to, you know, again, choose your path there. And I believe the attacker can get to choose that path. Now, let's talk about hills. So we talked about forests. This also applies to jungles. Again, the general recap is that you count up 1 point for each light woods hex, 2 points for each heavy wood hex. If you're at 3 or more points, you cannot see the target. All right, so woods, that's woods. Now hills. Let's say, let's move these mechs around. Let's say the Centurion is here. All right, and the Clint is here. Okay, so now very straight line here. You've got a level 1 hill. So what happens? So there's no additive thing where you have to count up like you do with the woods when it comes to hills. With hills, it's very simple. A mech stands at level 2. If the mech is behind a level 2 hill, you cannot see it. If it's behind a level 1 hill, it's half obscured. That's called partial cover. This also applies to level 1 buildings as well. So whether this is a hill or a building, same rule applies. I do have line of sight. However, two things happen. First of all, I add a +1 to the gator in that other category for partial cover. The second thing that happens when you're playing on the 2D map, any hit rolls to the legs are immediately discarded. You don't re-roll them, the shot's lost. It's as if you shot the hill instead of the legs. So it's sort of a double whammy. You add the +1 to hit, and if you roll legs, it's a total miss. Now that applies, again, like for example, even if this guy were, for example, elevated, and I don't have any good ones here. Oh, here we go. Okay, so each of these two mechs are on a level 1 hill. I don't know if you can see that. So right now these guys are each on a level 1 hill. There's a level 2 hill between them, right? So same deal. He'd be partially covered, right? Because you can imagine this hill stands a little higher. They're both elevated, and so that compensates for the fact that it's a level 2. But the difference between where they're at and what they're shooting across is 1 level. Half the mech would be covered there. Okay, so what else do we want to go over? So water. So water's the same way. Again, you just look at the difference in level. So the Clint here, like we moved them around, so the Clint here is now in level 1 water, or depth 1 water. If that Centurion was firing, it's all clear terrain. However, half of the Clint is covered. So again, leg hits are discarded, +1 to the gator. If the Clint is in this level 2 water, he would be completely immersed. He would be, actually, wouldn't even be able to target him. So you couldn't shoot at him at all. Same deal with these level 2 hills. Like if the Clint was here, okay, and my Centurion was here, there'd be 2 reasons I couldn't see this Clint. 1, I'm going through more than 3 points, or 3 or more points of terrain. And 2, there's level 2 hills here that would just block the line of sight anyway. So again, hopefully that makes sense. That's drawing line of sight on the hex grid. I think it's more mathematical. It's a little clunkier, because again, you got to count the hexes, and sometimes you're not always in a straight line. But that's the general gist of it. Now the important things are the distance that you can see through forests, right? The cumulative penalty for shooting through forests, and I guess I should point out a couple other things about forests before we move on. So the first one is, let's move our mechs around. Say my Clint is here. Okay, so he's in a light woods hex, standing in a light woods hex. My Centurion is here. Okay, so what happens now? Well, intervening woods, I have 1 point. This hex is not intervening. I can see the Clint. The Clint would get to if the Centurion fired, right? Actually, the Centurion would get a +1 penalty for this hex and a +1 penalty for this hex because the Clint is actually standing in a woods hex. So you would get a +2 to your total gunnery roll when you roll to attack. All right, let's swing it around this way. All right, so now the Centurion is attacking here, right? And sorry if I'm beating a dead horse here, just want to make sure everybody understands it. You'd get the 1 point here and the +1 to your gator. He's standing in this hex, so you get +1 to that other modifier, right, for cover and things like that, for the forests. So he would get a total of +3 to his gator, but this hex would not apply to that can I see you roll because, again, it's not an intervening hex. He's standing on it. Okay. So, and again, though, if he was in this hex, you couldn't see because it'd be 1, 2, 3 points, regardless of the modifier. There would be no way you could see that mech. All right, so here we are on the top of the mountain, and we're back with the Centurion. He's got a couple of shots here. There's a Jenner, there's an Atlas peeking out here behind the building, and then behind the forest in the backfield, there's that Panther. So let's talk about what it would basically entail now if the Centurion is up on this hill. And then there's one more concept I want to introduce about forests, and that would be seeing over forests entirely. So let's factor out range for a minute. Let's suspend our disbelief and assume that this Centurion has infinite range. So what would happen if I wanted to see that Atlas? Do I have line of sight or not? Well, it's pretty clear that I can see the Atlas for sure, but do I have completely unobstructed line of sight? I do not. Right? You can see that the left arm of the Atlas is covered by the building. And so in that scenario, what happens is, if you're playing by the rules in strategic operations, there's a +1 penalty to your other modifier for that partial cover. And in addition to that, any rolls that are made to hit on that arm location, so anything that I roll that is on the left arm, is also considered a miss. Okay. So same thing like with the hills, where if you hit the legs on the hex map, right, if you're behind a level 1 hill, you roll legs, they're an automatic miss. In this, it's a little more realistic because you actually miss only the locations that are covered by the partial terrain. That goes for buildings, hills, whatever it might be. All right, so what about this Jenner? Well, the Jenner is right in the forest there. So the way you determine a forest on a 3D hex map is by simply drawing a perimeter. All right, and I got a laser pointer here. You can kind of see, you draw a perimeter for the outermost trees, and you can see there's sort of a ring there that goes around the outside. So we know that the Jenner is basically right on the edge of the forest there. Its base is mostly in. So he would get that +1 cover modifier from the forest, but the Centurion still has line of sight because, again, there's no intervening woods, right? He's right on the edge of the forest. But what if that Jenner were a little further back? So let's say we moved the Jenner 2 inches back in the woods. And remember, we're playing, these are all light woods. That's how we roll. So let's assume the Jenner is 2 inches, or you could imagine it being 2 hexes deep in the woods. So what would happen now? Well, let's start with something simple. Let's say that our Clint is on level 0 terrain here and is shooting the Jenner. Well, based on what we learned on the 2D map, right, that Clint would take a +2 penalty to its gunnery, right, because there are 2 intervening hexes, or we can assume that there are 2 intervening inches right now. We would, of course, measure that. And remember, what we talked about in the shooting video, you always round up. So if it was at 2.1 inches, it would count as 3 inches, and thus it would be a non-starter because it would count as those 3 points of terrain, and you wouldn't even be able to see him. But let's assume he's at, just at 2 inches or 1.5 inch or whatever it might be. So that would basically round up to 2 full inches between them of intervening woods, and so that would be the +2. So, in addition to that, the Jenner's actually standing in woods for an additional +1. So that's a total of +3 to that Clint's roll, if that makes sense. All right, but what about the Centurion? Now, the Centurion is elevated. The Centurion is on a level 2 hill. So what does that do? Well, when you are elevated, you can see over things. Now, by standard rules, forests count as level 2 in height. So when a mech is standing on a level 1 hill or greater, they can actually see over the forest. So when that Centurion draws its line of sight to the Jenner, like this, what happens is it ignores all of the intervening woods because it can see right over them and drop some missiles or whatever right on the Jenner there. Now the Jenner would still get the cover bonus from being in the forest, so it would get that +1, but those intervening hexes would be ignored. All right, so next example is this Panther hiding back here behind the woods. There's absolutely no way that Clint could see straight through those woods. It's probably 4, 5, maybe 6 inches of woods between it and the Panther. So that's just not a doable thing because, again, 1 point per inch or per hex, and so if you're 3 or more you can't see. No way that Clint could see. However, the Centurion, again, it's at level 2. It can fire, it sees over all of the trees. The Panther isn't even in the woods, it's outside of the woods, so there would be absolutely no cover bonus. It would count as unobstructed line of sight for the Centurion to see that Panther. So hopefully that makes sense. That's basically the big difference on a 3D map. One is the partial cover, right? So you only shots are only blocked for limbs and things that are actually covered and hidden. And 2, when you're looking at forests and hills, it's really a model's eye view of what they can see. You draw the perimeter around the forests and so on and so forth. So another final example here is, let's take our Atlas and let's move him on this side of the hill. All right, and let's take our Clint and we'll put our Clint, back here. So is anything blocked? So that Atlas is technically behind a level 1 hill, and we can see if we get down to the model's eye view that a little bit of that Atlas is covered. Now, by the rules in strategic ops, that would actually unfortunately count, and both of the legs would be basically completely obstructed. If you were on a 2D hex map, same rule would apply. So let's move the Atlas here behind the level 2 hill. All right, so if we move the Atlas behind the level 2 hill, we slide our Centurion out of the way, what can our Clint see? Well, our Clint can still see the Atlas on the 3D map. And the legs are completely covered, right? So it is going to be different in terms of what you can and cannot see. On a 2D map, a level 2 hill, it's basically like a giant square that comes up and blocks off everything. On a 3D map, it's more like what you would expect, if you were playing a Mech Warrior video game. You need something real big, or you need a really small mech, or you need to be right up next to it in order to be completely obstructed. Now, I will note that at DFA we do a little bit of a modification on those partial cover rules, and we have a post for all of our house rules. And so, we kind of play the rule that if 50% of the limb is not covered, it just doesn't count. So if you've got a toe behind a building and you're an Atlas, you're not getting complete cover on that leg. It just seems a little more realistic to us. But again, rules is written in strategic ops. If you've got a finger behind the building, that whole arm is not viable. So that is basically partial cover and terrain on a 3D map. Hopefully, again, that makes sense. If you have any questions, obviously post them up. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.